What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we're profiling DDD, a deck that got, once again, competitive just because of the support that we got in Battle of Chaos. This set has just been amazing, so many new archetypes, so many support for older decks that were really good before, and this is one of those decks that it's for those people who like to challenge themselves and play decks that are very complicated, they have so many combo lines, and this is one of those decks that if you want to be a master of, you have to commit a lot of time and effort into it, so it's one of those favorite decks that people just love playing around with, and I think it's one of the most fun decks that you can play in the format as well, because it's a deck that plays on its own first of all, which I think is very important in a format like this, because cards like the Brave Token Engine, the Brave Phoenix Enforcer packets, the Artifact Scythe, all these can become very repetitive very quickly, especially when you see them in a lot of decks, and this is one of those decks that doesn't play any of these engines, it just plays as a pure deck, and I think that a lot of people appreciate it, especially in a stale format. So it's a deck that you can have a lot of fun with, be very original with, and it can also win very consistently. So before we begin with the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off the monsters, we have of course 3 copies of Savant Kepler. This card is one of the normal summons. You have 2 normal summons in your deck, and this is the first one. It searches you a Dark Contract when you summon it. It's a scale 10. All those scales, you can place them with Gilgamesh on your field, which is why all these cards, even though they are normal summons, they can also be treated as scales whenever you want them, so they have multiple purposes. And the cool thing about this card and the next card I'm going to show you, which is the 3 copies of Savant Copernicus. This is the Armageddonite of the deck, which is the second normal summon. Both of these monsters have 0 attack points, so you can search them with Pure Erase Map, which is a card that a lot of people are kind of iffy about just because you have to pay half your life points to search normal summon, but I think in a deck like this, you need to be able to see your plays as consistently as possible, just because if you don't get to see a lot of plays, you cannot do much, because this is not one of those decks that has auto-win buttons, like Artifact Scythe or something like that. You have to break a board going second with a lot of cards that can be a lot of really good 1-for-1 cards and a lot of effects that your opponent has to negate, and when you're going first, you're summoning monsters that are not auto-wins, and you have to know how to interact with your opponent. Cards like your High King Caesar, cards like your Deus Machinex, all these cards, you need to be able to use them completely, so you need the most consistent deck possible in order to be able to go into these cards every single game. So I think searching your normal summons is very important, because you don't want to waste a search for your gate for a normal summon. You want to search them for the cards like your Griffin, like your Swirl Slime, your extenders that you want to use in your hand, so you need to be able to search these first and then go for the rest of the play. So you have to max them out, and I'm also playing 3 Pure Erase Map, which you'll see a little later in the video. Now, one of the new cards that we got is 3 copies of DD Griffin. Now, this card is absolutely amazing. So it's an extender that you can special summon from your hand if you control a DD monster, so it gives you free access to Gilgamesh very easily before you even commit to a fusion summon on the field, which is important, because if you summon a monster and then you're going to Genghis and you use Genghis for Gilgamesh, that's not the most optimal way, because you need 2 Genghis on the field in order to go for your High King Caesar to get an extra interruption. So this card just helps you get into your Pendulum before you even get to a fusion summon, and it also has an effect that if it's Pendulum summoned, you can discard a DD or Dark Contract card to draw a card. So even if you have multiple copies of cards you don't need, which will happen sometimes in this deck because you do play a lot of 3-offs, you can still discard them and then get a new card, because you can draw hand traps with this as well, because you do play a lot of hand traps in this deck, so it's not like you're drawing more combo pieces that you will not need. You might draw into more interruption. And also, if it's card special summon from the graveyard, you can add a DD card from your deck to your hand, which is extremely important, because there are other cards aside from your Dark Contracts right now that you can actually use for disruption, because we have a new trap card that is really powerful. So this card has 3 effects, and all 3 of them are so good. So a great addition to the deck, absolutely 3 of definite. Next, we have 3 copies of DD Swirl Slime. This is the fusion summon from the hand, another great card that helps you get more monsters to the field after you commit to a normal summon, and you do play a lot of cards in your hand that you do want in the graveyard, and Griffin is one of them. Sometimes, if you have multiple copies of this card, you want to be able to send it to the graveyard, because if you summon it with its effect, it will go to the extra deck, because it's a Pendulum monster once it leaves the field, so it won't go to the graveyard. But if you use it from fusion material with Swirl Slime from your hand, it will go to the graveyard, and then once you bring it back with Genghis, you'll be able to get the search. So yeah, this card is another amazing card. And now the deck plays a lot of 1-offs. A lot of these cards used to be 3-offs in the deck, but right now you don't really need to maximize on these, just because they can brick your hand very badly, especially now that you have more extenders that are much superior like Griffin, so you need to play only 1 copy of all of these cards just to be able to see them whenever you want them. And since the deck can search anything, it's not like these cards are hard to find, they're very easy. So first of all, we have 1 copy of DD Lamia. You can search this with your Dark Contracts, you can send this to the graveyard with Copernicus, and this card is another extender that you can summon from your hand or graveyard, and it gives you access to Siegfried, which is another piece of interaction that you can use. We have 1 copy of Necro Slime. This is basically a miracle fusion from the graveyard that you can use to summon another fusion monster. Same thing with the 1 copy of DD Vice Typhon. This card is another another monster. Basically the same thing as Necro Slime. The thing is that this card is a higher level than Necro Slime. This is the difference between those two. And now for the Pendulum Scales, you can get access to all of this with Gilgamesh, which is why you don't need to play more copies of these, because, for example, we'll play one copy of Abyss Ragnarok, which this card used to be a definite 3 of back in the day because of how powerful this card is, but because you can scale it very easily whenever you want, it's not like you really need to see this card. And the field effect as a monster, it's not like something you will be using a lot. You can still use it sometimes, but the thing is you have to use the effect of Swirl Slime in order to get this out of your hand, and there will be some hands where you're going to draw this and you won't use this effect to banish a monster, especially going second. But the thing you're going for the most is when you're going for Gilgamesh, you set this in the scale and you basically get an extra monster reborn. So yeah, this card is amazing. We have one copy of Didi Savan Thomas. This card here helps you grind forever, because as long as it's in the scale, you can keep getting back your Pendulum monsters from your face-up extra deck into your hand every single turn, and it gives you infinite advantage that you will always have something to do during the following turns, and as long as you have an extra deck, you can keep playing with this deck. We also have one copy of Didi Orthros. This is the backrow removal of the deck. This deck has pretty much everything. It has monster removal, it has backrow removal, and all of these are searchable with so many different ways. The deck has tools to deal with pretty much anything, and this is why I think it's such a great deck, and this is one of those reasons that you have backrow removal as well, so your Eldritch matchup doesn't suck completely, because if you didn't have it, you would have to either main deck backrow removal or side heavily for it, but we do have a searchable way to deal with backrow. And we also have one copy of Didi Cerberus, which is another card that you can manipulate your levels, because your Kepler is level 1, and you want to make it level 4 with this card, just to be able to go into higher plays, because once you go into your Caesar, and then you can go into your King Tail, all of those monsters you need to Xyz summon and then link them away for more copies of Gilgamesh. It doesn't get an effect, but it gets the effect in the graveyard. Gilgamesh is once per turn, but you need to get these cards to the graveyard to search your Dark Contracts, to search your DD cards to the graveyard. You need to be able to Xyz summon, so the level manipulation effect of this card comes in handy very, very often. Now, since this deck has a very self-contained engine that you can play with a lot of one-offs and some three-offs, you do have a lot of space, and you need to play hand traps, especially in a format like this, with Scythe being everywhere. If you don't play hand traps, and multiple that is, because drawing one hand trap can sometimes mean nothing, especially if your opponent has the adventure packets in hand, you need to play a lot of hand traps in order to be able to survive in a format like this. So I have space for 10 hand traps in this deck. You can play other hand traps if you want, but I'm going to show you the ones I'm playing. Playing, of course, 3 copies of Ash Blossom. You should be playing this in pretty much anything, because it's the most generic one, and it has the most options of being good against, because cards like the next card, which is the 3 copies of Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, while very impactful in some matchups, there are always matchups that Ghost Ogre can be completely dead against, especially against Eldritch decks, which is why Ash Blossom is much superior. But the thing is, Fateful Adventure is such an important card to hit, and you need to play Ghost Ogre. And also, even if you draw it later, it's not a bad card, because you can use it to hit the Griffin Rider, because it has to go back into the deck in order to negate. So even if you draw this as 6th card, when your opponent tries to negate one of your cards with Griffin Rider, you can Ghost Ogre it, it will go to the graveyard, and you will also get the effect off. So it's a really good card to draw, like basically like an impermanence. When you draw a 6th card, you can still use it very efficient. We have 2 copies of Effect Veiler and 2 copies of Infinite Impermanence. These 4 you can basically switch around. You can even play more if you want to. If you don't like pure race map in the deck, which some people don't, you can play 3 more hand traps, and some people play Nibiru. But the problem with Nibiru is that it's a card that you have to draw it with another hand trap in order to be able to do something. If you draw it on its own, most of the time it's just going to get met with a Griffin Rider and it won't do much. Ash Blossom on its own can negate Water Enchantress when it's trying to search Aramazir. Ghost Ogre on its own can destroy the Fateful Adventure before it searches. So all these cards, aside from Impermanence and Veiler, which again on their own are not the best, but they're better than Nibiru, just because Nibiru is a card that you're going to use mid-combo, and there are other ways to stop Nibiru aside from Griffin Rider. So this is why Ash and Ogre are definite 3-offs for me. These cards are 2-offs, and if you want, you can play Nibiru as well, but keep in mind, in order to make Nibiru work, you have to see it with another hand trap. Now, moving on to the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Dark Contract with a Gate. This card searches you any DD monster from your deck. Amazing card. You can search this card with your Kepler, and this is the play you're going for most of the time, but there are other cards you can search with Kepler in case you have hard drawn both, which is the 1 copy of Dark Contract with a Swamp King. This is another fusion spell. You need to be able to go into your fusion monsters to go into different plays. If you want to get 2 level 6 monsters on the field to go for your Caesar, you can do that. If you want to summon your Dark and then use your Lamia to go into Siegfried, that's another play. The deck has so many options that it's very difficult for me to tell you what you can do with this deck, and it's not like there's a certain combo video that you can do, because the combos vary from certain matchups, from certain plays that you can do depending on what hand trap your opponent has, or if you're going second. It's very, very difficult to teach you this deck. You have to build it and you have to play test it a lot in order to be able to see exactly how this deck does. It's very, very difficult to learn how to play this deck just by watching guides on YouTube. So watching the deck lists and then picking them up for yourself, this is how you play this deck, and the options that it has is absolutely amazing. And moving on to one of the new cards that we got in Battle of Chaos is 1 copy of Dark Contract with Patent License. This is a field spell, which is a Dark Contract, so you can search it, and also has the effect that if your opponent special summons a monster from the extra deck, if it's Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Link, but that it's the same as one of the DDD monsters you control, you basically burn your opponent for 1,000, and your opponent cannot special summon a monster with the same type for the rest of this turn. So your opponent has to be very, very careful of what they're doing, especially if you have a lot of different monsters, because it's very easy to have an Xyz and a Link on the field with all those cards, because the Machine X is free monster that you can summon on top, and Gilgamesh is always going to be on the field. But if you know what your opponent is playing, you can basically summon a Synchro Monster against Dragon Link. That's going to be very hurtful, because if they summon the Chaos Ruler, that means they're not going to be able to go into Savage or the Abyss. You can summon Fusion Monsters against other decks. It basically varies depending on the matchup, and this card gives you a lot of options and some lockdown potential. And if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add a DD monster from your graveyard or your face-up Pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand, so you can get some recovery as well with this card. So even if your opponent deals with it, you are getting back something. So it's not the worst thing if your opponent deals with this card. So this is why you don't need to play more than one copy, because it's a card that it's a decent card in some matchups. There will be matchups where this card will be completely dead, but still, at least it doesn't say that it has to go to the graveyard by your opponent's card. So even if it's completely dead, you can just send this card to the graveyard on your own and you're going to get a card back. We have 3 copies of Pure Race Map. I've talked about this before, and I really like this card in the deck. I don't really care about the 4,000 life points I pay. If you're going to game 3 and you're closing into time, you can always side these cards out. But during the early game and during the first games where you don't really care about the life point disadvantage, you have to get to your normal summons before you commit to pretty much anything. Because if you have to commit to a special summon of a fusion monster and maybe a normal summon of a random monster before you go into Gilgamesh, that means you're not going to get the full value out of your Kepler and your Copernicus, because if you don't normal summon these, it's basically a waste to search them later into the combo because they don't do much. I mean, yeah, Copernicus gets its effect if it's special summon as well, with Kepler as well, but the thing is, there are not very easy ways to search to special summon Kepler because it's a level 1. Copernicus, yes, you can search and then special summon it to get a Foolish Burial, but it's much more optimal to normal summon these first, see what your opponent does, and then play accordingly, which is why I love this card in the deck. We also play 1 copy of 1-for-1. You have a lot of targets you can summon with this card. Kepler is one of them, but if you normal summon Kepler, you have your Lamia, you have your Necro Slime. This card has a lot of options. And we also have 1 copy of Foolish Burial because you do play a lot of good cards in the graveyard. Sometimes you want a Swirl Slime in the grave to special summon a monster from the hand. Sometimes you want your Necro Slime or your Vice Default Fusion summon, or sometimes even sending Griffin to the graveyard to bring it back to get a search is sometimes the play. So yeah, this card has a lot of utility as well. And the last card we play in the deck is another one of the new cards, which is 1 copy of DDD Henhad. So this card gives you basically a crackdown that is searchable. So if you control a DDD monster, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls, you take control of it, it negates its effects, it cannot attack, but if it was a monster that was special summoned from the extra deck, it is treated as a DDD monster, so you can summon Machine X on top of it. So this card is absolutely ridiculous. It just gives you more interaction that the deck desperately needed because it was relying heavily on the extra deck to get interruptions on the board, but this card just basically gives you 1 more in the main deck that you can search whenever you want. For the extra deck, we have 2 copies of Flame Gengenkis. The reason you're playing 2 copies of this card is not because you want to be able to use its effect multiple times, it's because you want to be able to overlay 2 level 6 monsters to summon your Hiking Genghis, your Hiking Caesar, I'm sorry, and this card is the one that you allow you to play around Nibiru and other stuff, but we'll get to that once we get to the Xyz monsters. Next, we have 1 copy of Hiking Genghis. This is the level 8 monster. It basically does the same thing as Genghis, just gives you more cards back from the graveyard, but it also has an effect that going second, it had come up a lot. So during your own turn, you can target face-up spells and traps your opponent controls up to the number of DDD monsters you control and basically negate them. So if you're playing against a deck like a trap deck like Eldritch, you can negate the activation of any card. Basically, you don't care if your opponent's skills drain you if you get this card on the field, because you're just going to negate it for the turn, set up your board, and then basically go from there, and your opponent has to answer their own skill drain if they're playing. If they're playing Eldritch, they don't have to, but if they're playing anything else, you don't really mind. So the deck can play around backrow decks really well. It's just that you have to commit to a fusion summon early if you want to be able to do that, and you need to summon this card ASAP if you're playing against a backrow deck. And it's also a level 8 monster, which can sometimes give you more options, because the deck does have other extra deck cards I am not playing, but you can. Kali Yuga is one of those cards that some people play, but some others don't. I am not playing it, but if you want it, you can play it, especially if you're playing in the locals with a lot of backrow decks. Then Kali Yuga gets a lot of value because it's a card that you can basically summon turn 1, and then during your opponent's end phase, detach a material to Harpy's Feather Duster their board, so you don't really care about your own cards that you lose because you're going to get to the plays you want anyway. So Kali Yuga is a card you can consider. I'm not playing it, but if you're playing in a very backrow heavy local format, then you can definitely. And we also play 1 copy of DDD Oracle King Dark. This is here for 2 reasons. First of all, this card is the reason you can go into Siegfried because it's a level 7 monster, and also the deck, even though it's notorious for losing life points on its own, ironically it can win in time because of this card. As long as you take out your peer race maps and you don't activate something that costs you a lot of life points like this, if you summon this card early and you use like an effect of Ragnarok in the scale, which costs you 1000 life points when you take 1000 burn when you use the effect to summon, if you have Oracle King Dark on the field, you gain those life points instead. So it's very, very easy to win in time as well, which is another thing that this deck can do. What this deck can't do, I mean, this deck can pretty much do anything, even win in time, even though it has the self-burn effects, but because of this card, you can basically reverse that and win in time instead of lose in time. For the Synchro Monsters, we have one copy of Siegfried. Because of Dark, it's very, very easy to summon this card, is basically another free interruption. We have one copy of Baroness. This card is another card that you can summon. The thing is, Gilgamesh locks you into DDD for the rest of this turn once you set the scales with its effect, but sometimes you don't even want to do the plays before you Pendulum Summon, and when you go into cards like this, you can basically go into Baroness to get a free negate, or you can go into a Zeus, which will give you more plays going second, because it's very easy to Xyz summon a monster before you Pendulum Summon, because all you need to do is normal summon a Copernicus and special summon a Griffin, which are both level 4, so you can go into a Caesar, and then go into a Machine X. If it manages to land an attack, then you can summon Zeus, and you can do all that before you use Gilgamesh's effects to try bait effects, so it's not a bad thing to play monsters in the extra that are not DDD monsters. And of course, if you don't have Baroness, then this is why I said Kali Yuga is another option, which is a really good card, because I know that this is one of those decks that a lot of budget players choose to play as well, because it's very, very cheap, and Baroness is what would make this deck not budget, so you can replace this with Kali Yuga and basically see pretty much the same results. It's not that big of a difference. It's a card that you don't summon often enough in order to be able to invest in it and actually be worth it 100% of the time if you don't have it. But if you have it, it's a really good card to have in the extra deck. For the Xyz monsters, we have one copy of Wave King Caesar. Now, this card in the second one, the Marksman King Tell, these are monsters that you summon and then you immediately link away for more copies of Gilgamesh in order to get their graveyard effects, because when your Caesar is sent from the field to the graveyard, you add a Dark Contract card from the deck to the hand, and when your Tell goes to the graveyard, you send a DD or Dark Contract card from your deck to the graveyard. So both of these cards get effects once they're linked away for Gilgamesh, and this is why you have them. Their field effects are not very relevant, you don't really need them, you just want them to summon them, to link them away, and get more searches. We have one copy of High King Caesar. Now this is the card I was talking about that you need to play the second Genghis for in order to be able to summon this monster right here. It needs 2 level 6 fiends in order to summon, so it's very difficult to summon if you don't play the second copy of Genghis, and this card is another way to play around Nibiru because it negates summons, and also it is another interruption. This deck basically has interruptions. With this card, we have the next card, which is 2 copies of Divisor King Deus Machine X. This is another card from Battle of Chaos that is absolutely amazing. So it's a free monster that you can summon by just slapping it on top of a DDD monster, and then its effect reads that once your opponent activates a monster effect, you can either detach 2 materials from this card or destroy a Dark Contract card you control, and basically you silent honor arc that monster and put it as material to this card. So this is another piece of interaction that you can use, and even if it doesn't have 2 materials, it's very easy to have Dark Contracts on the field and you don't really need to use again, so you can just pop them and then take the monster. So it's not like you have to commit to an Xyz summon to make this card work. Even if you just summon Oracle King Dark on the field and then slap it on top of it, you don't really mind because you do get a free beater that is going to give you interruptions, and of course all of those Xyz monsters threaten to go into your Sky Thunder Zeus, which going second before you summon Gilgamesh is what you're going to try to do, so you can basically threaten to destroy your opponent's entire board and then go into Gilgamesh, go into your Pendulum Summon and proceed from there. Another amazing card that just gives you a lot more options going second. And the only Link monster we play is 3 copies of Gilgamesh. The thing is that you don't need to play other Link monsters just because once you summon this, you are not going to summon anything other than DDD monsters for the rest of the turn. So in order to link away the copies of Tell and Caesar, you need multiple copies of this card. You don't play 3 because you're going to use its effect multiple times in a duel. I hardly ever use its effect to set scales more than 1 time throughout a duel, but you need 3 in order to link away over and over and over again in order to get these graveyard effects, so this is why this card is here. And of course, if it's negated, the second and third copies then will come up during the following turns in order to set your Pendulum Scale. So yep, that's the deck, guys. DDD is one of the most fun decks for me. I've just been enjoying playing it so much, and I know that a lot of people enjoy this deck, and for good reason. So if you're a rookie and you want to pick up a challenging deck in order to basically learn the game a little bit better, because it's not like you're learning how to play a specific deck by playing this deck, you learn a lot of stuff for the game in general. So if you pick up this deck and you try it a lot, you're going to see that you're going to become a much better player in general. So I highly recommend it for both rookies and veterans. Veterans because it's a very fun deck to play, especially in a format where everything else is basically playing the same engines and you're playing something unique which doesn't rely on any engine in order to go off. And if you're a rookie, it will just help you become a much better player. So for any type of player out there, I highly recommend this deck. It's very fun, very good, and very challenging to play. It will will just get you to another level. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.